In order to solve that problems, the process what they are going to follow, it's not one and the same. So it differs from one department to another, in the same way from one organization to another. There should be a good communication between the researcher and the organization. So here the researcher has to have a proper communication with the organization who is having the problem in the purchase department. There are two main sources for collection of data. One is primary sources, other one is secondary sources. Hello everyone, I am Harshita, lecturer, Department of Commerce, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, the Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. My dear students, today we are in the 5th session of Unit 1 of the subject, that is Business Research Method, and the Unit 1 is Introduction to Business Research. So, we were discussing few of the concepts relating to business research, and we shall quickly recall what we have discussed in a previous session. So, in a previous session, I have covered this topic, that is ethical issues in business research. So, what are the ethics that has to be followed by a researcher during his research process? So, we had few of the points that we have already discussed in a previous session, that is, as we are going to deal with a human behavior, that is in the business research, so we have to follow certain ethical issues from the point of researcher, at the same time from the point of respondents. So we have discussed that in a previous session. Today we shall discuss one of the important topic, that is 10 marks question. You might expect 10 marks for this particular topic, and the topic is business research process. Now what do you mean by business research process? Of course, a researcher will identify a particular problem and he will be finding the solution to that particular problem. It's not an easy task. At the same way, it is not a simple task to find a solution for a particular problem of an organization. So here, business research is a systematic study. Of course, business research is a scientific as well as systematic study. It differs from one organization to another. So here the problem what the organization is going to face, it is not one and the same. It differs from one organization to another, in the same way from one department to another department. Within the same organization itself, the requirement or problems are not unique. Now, in an organization itself, there are a number of departments. So, it may be purchase department, sales department, marketing department, finance department. Now, each and every department will have their own problems. So, in order to solve that problem, what the researcher will do? Researcher will collect the data. And the collection of data is also not one and the same. After collecting the data, they will find out the solution for that particular problem. Now, within the same organization itself, there are a number of departments and each department will have their own problems. Even with all these limitations, some organizations follow a common hierarchy or common process in order to find a solution for that particular problem. Even though the departments are different, even though the problems of each and every organization is different, now we have taken a common business research process. Let us discuss this today. Or such process includes different steps. They are called as steps in research. Whatever the steps we are going to follow in research activity, that is called as what? Business research process. What are the step-by-step procedure what we are going to follow? That is called as what? Business research process. Of course, the activity is different, the problem is different, and the problem of one organization to another organization is different, but we have taken a common business research process. So, let us see what are the steps which are included in business research process. So, the first one is identifying the business research problem. So, we shall discuss all these points in detail. Now, time being, go through this process. So, here there are 10 steps in business research process. So, the first one is identifying the business research problem. Second one is determining business research objectives. So, we have to determine what is the objective. Next one is developing the hypothesis. I will discuss in detail what is this hypothesis. Next one is preparing business research plan. So, you know, for each and every activity which has to be conducted, there should be a proper plan. In research also, we have to make a plan. And the next one is determining sources of information and data. So from where we have to collect the data. Next one is determining the sample design. I'll tell what is this sample design. Next one is analysis and interpretation of data. So we have collected the data, we have to analyze and interpret, or that we'll discuss in detail. Next one is hypothesis testing. So we shall see later. Preparing research report and recommendation and follow up. So these are the important process which has to be followed in business research. And my dear students, make sure that when they ask a question on process, you have to write as it is, one by one. You can't shuffle everything and write, because first we'll start with the problem, then we shall wind up with recommendation and follow up. So make sure that you will follow the same sequence, because it is a process. So we can't skip any of the activity, and we cannot move to the other activity. So we have to follow the same process. So you have to follow the same business research process. So it is called as a process, because we cannot skip any of the activity in between, so that we can get the answer for a particular problem. So it has to be in a same sequence. Now, we shall discuss in detail coming to the first point, that is first step, identifying business research problem. Of course, whenever we are going to collect the information, or whenever we want to solve a particular problem, first we have to know the problem, correct? So, identifying the problem itself is a big task. Now, what do you mean by problem? Problem well defined is half solved. So, there is a statement, or there is a proverb, that is, problem well defined is half solved. So when we identify a problem, then it is half solved. Then we can take measures to solve that problem. In the same way, when we take a doctor, so if we don't know, or if the doctor does not know what is the disease, then how the treatment can be given? First he has to identify the disease, then the treatment will start. Correct? In the same way, in research also, first we have to know what is the problem. Now, taking about a purchase department. So, we have a purchase department. We know there is some problem in the purchase department, but we don't know what is the problem. So, simply if we collect the data, it is a mere waste. So, what you have to do? First, we have to identify what is the problem. Then, in order to solve the problem, we have to collect all the data. Here also, problem well defined is half solved. That means a researcher at the outset should define the research problem in understandable terms. So, being a researcher, he has to understand what is a problem. What is a problem and how it can be solved later is different. First, you have to identify the problem. A problem should be well defined before beginning the research work. So, each and every researcher, before he begins the research work, he has to identify the problem clearly. During the problem identification stage, there should be a proper communication between the researcher and the party to whom research results are needed. Suppose if the organization is having a problem in the purchase department. So, what the organization will do? Organization will appoint a researcher, or he will contact the researcher to solve that particular problem. So here there should be a good communication between the researcher and the organization. So here the researcher has to have a proper communication with the organization who is having the problem in the purchase department. The researcher should clearly understand the research problem. So he should clearly understand what is the research problem. He should study the influencing environmental factors. So there are both internal as well as external factors. So what do you mean by internal factors? The factors which are there inside the organization. External factors means what? The factors which is outside the organization. In the same way, there are controllable factors as well as non-controllable factors. So here the researcher has to understand what is the problem, whether it is internally or externally, or whether it can be controlled or whether it cannot be controlled. So, on the research problem, so he has to study in detail both the internal as well as external factors relating to that particular problem. He should analyze the problem in such a way that it is properly and meaningfully understood. He has to understand the problem carefully. So this is your first step. So what is the first step under business research process? That is identifying the business research problem. Okay. Second one is determining business research objective. Now we have identified what is the problem. Now we have to collect the information in order to achieve the objectives. Now we have to know what is the main use of conducting the research activity in order to achieve the objective. Correct? So what we have to do, the second step in the business research is to determine the objectives of research. So what is the main objective of research? Why we have to collect the information? Of course, we have identified the problem. Now we are going to collect the information. So why we have to collect the information? What is the objective? That is your second step. Once the problem of the business research has been identified and clearly defined, the ultimate and functional objective should be determined. Now, I have identified the problem. Now, what is the main objective? What I have to be proved? That is known as what? That is objective. Objective will be determined by considering the cost as well as strategies involved in the research. So, in order to achieve my objective, what are the cost which is required? What are the strategies that has to be applied in order to achieve my objective? So, that has to be analyzed by the researcher. Functional objectives relate to the research problem. They can be achieved with the available technology as well as knowledge. So, in order to achieve the objective, what are the measures that has to be taken? What are the necessities that has to be made in the organization? The objective of business research are large in number and they depend on the opportunities available and the problem that manager may face during the business. So, I have identified the problem. Now, I want to reach that objective. So, what are the measures that has to be taken? So, whether there is sufficient technology or whether there is proper technology in the organization, whether do I have proper knowledge in order to achieve that objective, everything has to be analyzed in the second step. Next one is developing the hypothesis. Now, I have identified a problem. I know what is my objective. Now, randomly, as per my knowledge, I'll make some assumptions. That is known as what? Hypothesis. Assumptions about that particular problem. I'll make some assumptions. That is known as what? Hypothesis. Hypothesis is an experimental statement created to test the validity of the problem decided by the research. So, in order to test that particular experiment, I'll make some assumptions by myself according to my knowledge or whatever the items or whatever the thing that has to be experimented in the future in order to achieve the objective. That I'll list in detail, which is known as what? Hypothesis. A systematic human resource planning neither creates surplus staff. So, this is an example here. A systematic human resource planning neither creates surplus staff nor deficit staff in the organization is an example for hypothesis. Now, what does this example tell us? That a systematic human resource planning. So, if there is proper resource planning, then there will not be any surplus staff, neither there will be any deficit staff. So, this is my hypothesis. Okay. So, this statement is experimental in nature. Now, I have to prove. So, if there is proper human resource planning, so whether this statement can be proved or not. So, I have made a statement that is a hypothesis, that is after having human resource planning, there will be no excess human resource. In the same way, there will be no deficit human resource. So, this is my hypothesis. Now, by doing the researcher, I have to prove. So, that is known as what? That is, this statement is experimental in nature and the validity is tested through research. So, through research, I am going to prove that statement. For this purpose, data is collected. Of course, in order to fulfill or in order to test that hypothesis, what I have to do? I have to collect sufficient data or information. Analyze. I have to analyze the information and its validity is tested by applying statistical devices. So, I have to analyze and interpret the information. This is known as what? Hypothesis testing. So, in the beginning of the research activity itself, I'll make an hypothesis and I'll collect the data for that, I'll collect information for that, I'll analyze and interpret so that at the end of my research, I'll come to know whether my hypothesis is correct or not. So that is known as what? Hypothesis testing. The hypothesis shows the direction of the study of the research problem. So this is a main thing which shows the direction to the research problem. So that is third step is developing the hypothesis. Next one is preparing business research plan. So you know for each and every activity there should be a proper plan. In the same way, first I have identified the problem, I know what is my objective, next I have created some hypothesis to my subject. Now what I have to do? I have to prepare business research plan. So business research plan is also known as research plan. So it is also known as what? Research plan. That is planning in advance about the activity what I am going to do in the future. It will build a framework to bring the research program to practice. Of course, always the plans what we are going to make. So it not only relating to research, any other activity. So it acts as a framework. Suppose my exams are near. I have to prepare a proper timetable and I have to plan for my exam. So it is a framework. So within which I am going to do my activity in order to prepare for my exam. So here also preparing business research plan. So business research plan is also known as research plan. It always acts as a framework, bring the research program to practice. So in order to achieve my objective, this business research plan acts as a framework. It provides blueprint to begin the research program. So after making plan, I'll follow up that plan so that I can achieve my objective easily. So it acts as a blueprint. The research plan acts as a model to carry out formal survey and investigation. So before I plan in advance so that I'll follow that plan and I can achieve my objective. So here it carry out formal survey as well as investigation. So in order to collect the information, I have to go for survey as well as investigation. Correct? So this business research plan help in doing so. It reveals some methods and procedure necessary for obtaining the information. So in order to collect the information, this acts as a framework or blueprint. Next, it determines the methods and sources for collection of data. So there are various sources to collect the data. It may be primary sources or secondary sources, which you are going to learn in your next unit. That is how we are going to collect the data. So this is about business research plan. Here this business research plan gives a proper framework or blueprint how the research activity has to be conducted. The research plan designed for a particular problem includes the following factors. Let us see how the business research plan help the researcher to conduct the research. So the first one is the ways of data collection. How the information or data has to be collected. I have told you there are many sources to collect the data. It may be primary sources or secondary sources. Now what do I mean by primary sources? Here the sources of data is collected for the first time. They are known as primary sources. For example, I am directly going to some respondents and I am giving them questionnaire and collecting the data directly. That is known as what? Primary sources. And the secondary sources of data means what? They have already published data from where I am going to take that. That is known as what? Secondary sources. So here through proper business research plan, because it is decided in advance, we'll come to know what are the ways to collect the data. Whether the data can be collected through primary sources or through secondary sources. Next one is the skill held by the researcher. By framing the business research plan itself, one can come to know what is the skill of the researcher, whether the researcher is able to solve that particular problem or not. So that can be identified through business research plan. Next one is organizing data collection sources and reliability of the selected sources. So after collecting the data, how we have to organize the data. So here the data how we are going to collect, it cannot be directly given in the form of report. So it has to be analyzed and interpreted, where it has to be presented in the form of tabular formation or in the graphical formation. So that can be clearly understood by business research plan. Next one is the time available for research. So what is the exact time which is required to conduct that particular research activity? So it may be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So what is the duration? So in what period we can solve that particular problem of the business? So that is the duration. Next one is the cost related to the research. So it's not an easy task to collect the information. So it requires huge cost as well as huge time, because when we go for primary data collection, so we have to individually meet each and every respondents and collect the information, where the cost is very high. Or sitting at one place, we can refer the secondary data also. Correct? So these are the few aspects what we come to know after preparing this business research plan. So that was your next step. Now coming to the fifth step, determining the sources of information and data. So from where you are going to collect the information? What is the main source of information to collect the data? So that is your next step. That is, after in the business research process, I have told you it is not a easy task, it is a step-by-step procedure. So your fifth step is that how we are going to collect the data. Of course, in order to solve a particular problem, we need sufficient information, correct? How I am going to collect that information? That is known as what? Determining the sources of information. From where do I get the information? So the sources of data collection depend on the research design and the purpose of research. So already I have prepared a research design or the research plan, correct? Based on that, I'll decide what is the sources of data. From where do I get the information for my particular problem? So it may be primary sources or secondary sources. So this I have told you, there are two main sources for collection of data. One is primary sources, other one is secondary sources. Now what do I mean by primary sources? When the researcher collects and records the information directly from the respondents. So I have given an example that I'll go to the respondents and I'll distribute the questionnaire where I'll collect the information directly from the respondents. So they are termed as what? Primary sources. So when the researcher collects and records the information directly from the respondents, they are termed as what? Primary sources. Or by observing the situation. Or by observing the situation, even there also I can collect the data. Then such source is called as what? Primary data source. So primary data source means what? Here the data is collected directly from the respondents. It may be either directly going and collecting the information, or through observation also they can collect the information. Next one is the data collected before the commencement of this research constitutes the secondary data. So this I have told you, it may be from the old articles, or it is been already published from where, or it is already there. And in primary data, for the first time I am going to collect the information. But in secondary data, it's already been collected, from which I am going to collect the information. Okay. So that is known as what? Secondary data, and the data is collected before the commencement of research itself, and they are constituted as what? Secondary data. Secondary data may be from internal or external sources. So here these collection of data can be internally, that is inside the organization, or outside the organization. So these are the two types of data. One more type you have, that is formal data. The main two types are primary source as well as secondary source. Now let us see what is this formal data. That is, it is obtained from the periodicals. That is, periodicals, monthly or quarterly journals, or annual publications. So here these type of data, that is formal data, are already been published, from which the researcher is going to take the information. Newspapers are also recognized as carriers of formal data. Informal data is not available in the form of such published sources. So formal data means formally it has been published, and from which the researcher is going to collect the information. That is termed as formal data. So your fifth step will be determining the sources of data and information. So we have identified the problem, we know what is the objective, we know how it has to be solved, we have made a proper research plan. Now we have to know, in order to achieve that plan, from where we have to collect the information. What is the main source of information? Whether we have to go for primary source or secondary source, that we have to decide in the fifth stage. Now coming to the sixth one, determining the sample design. So it is always difficult for the researcher to collect the information from a large group of population, correct? Because we cannot meet each and every individual and collect the information. For that reason, what he'll do, he will select a group of people which is called as what? Sample. So irrespective of whole universe, he is going to select a group of people and is going to collect the information, which is known as what? Sample design. So it is not always possible to study the problem relating to the universe or population. So it is highly difficult because the population is very huge. So we cannot go and collect the information from the whole population or from the whole universe. It takes more time. Of course, the main limitation is that in order to collect the information from the universe, it requires more time, involves more expenditure and requires more efforts also. It's not an easy task because the universe is too huge. At the same time, we cannot collect information from all the respondents in the universe. In order to avoid these limitations, sample is selected. Now, what do you mean by sample? So, instead of going through whole universe, we are going to make a group or we are going to collect the information from a group of people. That is known as what? Sample. So, sample is selected from the universe and sample units are studied for research purpose. For research activity, instead of going through whole population, we are making into a group and collecting the information. The results obtained by studying the sample units represents the universe or population. By studying the sample itself, we are going to get the result of whole population. So, the result obtained by studying the sample units represent the universe or population. So, here the sample is going to represent the whole universe or population. The process of sample design includes sampling framework. So, how should be the sampling framework? So, framework means what? How the sample should be. Next is sampling selection. So, we have to select a proper sampling, correct? So, we have to select a proper group of people. And process and sample size. So, what do you mean by sample size? Sample size means from how many respondents we are going to collect the information. So, the sample size may be 100 respondents. So, irrespective of going through whole universe, we can collect the information from 1 lakh respondents. So, this 1 lakh will be the sample size. Okay. So, this sample size will represent the whole universe or population. So, this is determining the sample design. Next one is analysis and interpretation of data. Now, instead of going through whole population, I have selected a group of people which is called as sample and have collected the information from them. That is, which represents the universe. This sample represents the universe and have collected the information. Now, whatever the information which I have collected, so it is not in a way of understandable manner. So, I have to make my research work in an understandable manner so that I have to analyze and interpret the data. Now, after collecting the data from the appropriate target group, that is from the sample, the next step in the research process is to analyze and interpret the collected data. Now, what do you mean by analyze and interpret? So, suppose if I collect the information from 1 lakh sample, so what I have to do, or 1 lakh respondents. So, whatever the information which I get, it is in bulk. So, what I have to do, I have to make it too short so that it can be conveyed to the users. Okay. So, I have to analyze and interpret the data. So, data analysis includes statistical tests such as editing, coding, tabulation and analysis. So, here data analysis means what? Whatever the information I have collected in bulk, I have to make it as simple as possible. I have to make it too short so that it can be understandable to the users. So I use the statistical tests such as editing, coding, tabulation and analysis. There are a lot of information which are useless. Okay, so such type of information has to be deleted. Whatever the information which is actually required, I have to edit everything and have to make in a form of tables. Research gains its importance only when the data is properly interpreted. Now, what do you mean by interpretation? Interpretation means what? Conveying in an understandable manner, that is known as interpretation, or presenting in an understandable manner is known as interpretation. At this stage, the researcher prepares frequency distribution table to the data. So, what the researcher will do? Researcher will use all the statistical tools in this situation in order to analyze and interpret the data. So, this is about analysis and interpretation of data. Next one is hypothesis testing. So, in my third stage, what I have done? So, in my first stage, I have identified the problem. Second stage, I know what is my objective. Third stage, I have made some statement for testing in the future. Correct? So, I have made some assumptions to be tested in the future about my research work, which was known as what? Hypothesis. Now, in the 8th stage, what I'll do? I'll test all the hypotheses because I know I have collected all the data. So, I have interpreted it as well as I have analyzed those data. Now, while comparing my beginning hypothesis statement, now I have to check that hypothesis with the exact result what I got after the collection of data. That process is known as what? Hypothesis testing. After analyzing the data, the researcher first tests the hypothesis. So, I have to test my hypothesis which I have made earlier, finding out whether the result is consistent with or against the hypothesis. In my third step, I have developed few of the hypotheses. Now, I have got data, I have collected all the data and information, I have analyzed it. Now, I have to check whether my hypothesis is similar to what I got the exact result at the end of my research. So, I have to test those hypotheses. Statisticians will use a number of tests for this purpose. So, they will use number of statistical tools or number of statistical tests in order to test the hypothesis. They are t-test, f-test and chi-square test. These tests will be applied according to the nature of research. According to the nature of research, what the researcher will do? He will apply all the statistical tools to see that whether the hypothesis matches with the exact result which I got at the end of research. Hypothesis selection or omission can be inferred from hypothesis testing. Suppose anything is missed out, so that can be identified in hypothesis testing. So, this is about hypothesis testing. Next one is preparing a research report. Now, I have tested my hypothesis. I have came to know what are the activities I can be proved or it can be proved through research activity. Now, the next one is I have to prepare. So, I have bulk information. I have made it too short. I have analyzed and interpreted it and have checked or I have tested my hypothesis. Now, I have to submit in the form of a report. So, here the report can be either oral report or written report, but written report is more preferable than oral report. Now, what do I mean by research report? So, preparing a research report is an important stage in the research process. So, after doing so many activities, if I don't prepare a report, it is useless. Correct? Because oral report does not act as a evidence, it does not act as a proof, it cannot be stored for a longer period of time. Correct? So, in such situation, I have to prepare a report of my studies or of the solution what I find out to a particular problem in the form of a report. So, preparing a research report is an important stage in the research process. The results of the research should be submitted in writing to the organization in a concise, straightforward and no way distracting from the original purpose. Now, how the research report should be? It should be as simple as possible. It should not be too long or too short. It should be in medium in nature. At the same time, it should be straightforward. At the same time, it should relate to the topic what the organization was facing. So, research report has to be prepared. Next, the research report should include the title, list of topics, synopsis. Now, here the research report should include the title, what was the problem. And the next one is list of topics. So, what are the topics which are included in the research? And the next one is synopsis. So, what do you mean by synopsis? It is a summary of research. So, there are many users who will not have sufficient amount of time to read the whole research work. In that situation, what they will do? They will read the synopsis of the research. This is, it will be a short summary about the whole research activity. Next one is research methodology. So, what are the methods which is being used in the research? Next, perceptions. What are their perceptions? What are the limitations? Of course, each and every research activity will have their own limitations. What are the problems they have faced? Next, conclusions. So, what is the conclusion about that research work? Next, recommendation. So, you have to write the recommendation of research work. Appendix, that is, what are the tools which are used to collect the information. So, it may be a questionnaire or any other thing which is, or any other formulas which are being used in order to solve a particular problem, that is appendix. Next, bibliography. So, what they have referred. So, whether they have referred the earlier research work in order to solve this particular problem, so that they have to mention in detail. So, this is about the research report. So, of course, whatever the research activity they have conducted, they have to present in the form of a report. Next, last one is recommendation and follow up. So, this is also one of the important process under business research. That is, follow up is an important stage in business research. That is, what is the validity? So, validity, acceptability, appropriateness and control are the key aspect of recommendation compliance. So, what is the validity of that research work? So, what are the recommendations they are going to give? How the users will accept the research work? Everything they have to mention in recommendation and follow up. Research can only be meaningful if the outcome of the research is agreed with the executives. So, here after preparing the research report, it will be submitted to the organization. Now, the research work will be meaningful only if it is accepted by the executives of the organization. Generally, this would be the final stage of business research. So, this would be the last stage of business research. So, once again, we shall recall everything. So, the first one is what? Identifying the business research problem. Of course, each and every research should know what is the problem. Then only they can find solution to that particular problem. So, the first thing is that identifying the business research problem. Next one is determining the business research objective. So, we have identified the problem. Now, we have to know what is the objective, where we are and where we want to be. So, that is known as what? Objective. Next one is developing the hypothesis. So, in the initial stage itself, what that has to be proved, what that has to be experimented. So, that has to be written in detail, which is known as hypothesis. Next, business research plan. So, they have to make a proper plan, how it has to be achieved. So, what are the sources of data from where we have to collect? They have to make a proper plan, which is known as business research plan. Next, determining the sources of information. Of course, we know what is a problem. Now, in order to solve the problem, from where we have to collect the information, that is sources of information. Next, determining the sample design. Now, whether I have to collect the information from the whole population or from a group of respondents, which is called as sample. So, I have to decide my sample size as well as sample design. Next, analysis and interpretation of data. Now, from the sample, I have collected the data, but I cannot present that data in the form in the same way how I have received. So, I have to make it too short. I have to throw off all the unknown things and I have to make it too short and I have to analyze and interpret the data. That is, it has to be presented in a or it has to be presentable, or it has to be presented in the understandable manner to the users. Next one is hypothesis testing. Whatever the hypothesis I have made earlier, now I have to test that hypothesis, whether it is possible to prove all the hypothesis or not. that is hypothesis testing. Next one is preparing research report. After that, I have to prepare a proper report, that is all the information cannot be included in that, only useful information has to be included and I have to present in the form of a report. Next one is recommendation and follow-up. This is a last stage of business research process where it is been presented to the executives or the organization and what are the feedback which is given by the executives. So, it will be meaningful only if it is accepted by the executives. So, these are the few business research process and I have told you it is a very important question for 10 marks in your examination. So, in my next session, I am going to discuss few more topics relating to problem formulation and the other topic is preparation of business research plan or proposal. So, this I have discussed in the business research process itself, but we shall discuss in detail because they might ask for 5 marks in your exam. So, in my next session, I am going to discuss these two topics. So, my dear students, hope you have understood today's session. See you all in my next session with a new topic. Till then, take care. Thank you.